We're all good friends, right? For the few of you I might not have met, my name's Derek Muller. I'm an associate professor here at Pepperdine, and I have the privilege of helping organize this festschrift in honor of Bob Cochran. So I want to open with a few remarks about his career, his influence, and I think we're going to hear a lot of those today. But as many of you know, he started here at Pepperdine in 1983. And I have heard from more than one person that they say it was one of the finest hires that Pepperdine ever made. So I think it speaks a lot to his legacy and his impact here at this institution. Bob's career understandably bridges a wide variety of topics, not just in law and religion, but theology and ethics. And I think in an era where interdisciplinary work in law is appreciated more than ever, thinking in particular about theology in the law is an important thing and something that I hope we see more of in our discussions. And I appreciate Bob's perspective on that front too. And Bob's not just, I think, a great scholar, but somebody who has long valued the exchange of ideas, and not just in the scholarly realm, the writing, but also in discussion and fellowship. And I think that's a wonderful reason to have a conference like this today, bringing together work and thinking about great ideas, but not just thinking about them, talking about them, having conferences, having students in classes that will talk about the symposia that they've attended, bridging a wide variety of areas and of scholarship and into practice, and thinking about what that looks like in the everyday life of a Christian in law. For Bob's work, he wants me to remind you, there are many of his reprints available on the table. So to the extent you have any interest in picking up a few of those, for those of you with cross-country flights, great reading material and light packing for a reprint on the plane. So I'm really excited about this conference. I want to thank, for a moment, Jenna DeWald is outside, so hopefully we're going to have a chance to thank her directly, but she's the real person who handled a lot of the logistics for this conference, and I'm deeply appreciative of her work in helping organize this. I handled some of the ideas, but most of it, I think, was ideas driven by Bob's legacy. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our Dean, Paul Karen, for a few opening remarks as well.
Good morning, everyone. I was told that this was a roast, and I guess I'm going to have to ad-lib on this. I want to welcome all of you to Pepperdine Law School on this extraordinarily special day. We talk a lot around here about excellence, faith, and community. And Bob Cochran's work and his life embody excellence, faith, and community. We're going to spend today talking about Bob's work as a scholar. When I was just a member of the faculty, I greatly respected Bob's work, and that respect has only grown since I've become dean. All of the metrics we use to measure the influence of legal scholarship are things that Bob excels in. I know we have some numbers people in the audience. So here is Bob's Google Scholar page. And if you can't see the fine print, his H index is 17, which may mean something to two of you in the room. But that's an extraordinarily high number and the second highest on our faculty. Bob's faith aids his work. As Eric mentioned also, he spends a lot of effort fostering a scholarly community in many ways, especially through those 18 Root Bar conferences he has led through the years, and any books that have emerged out of those conferences. So I know we're all very much looking forward to the panels today discussing the influence of Bob's work. But I want to spend just a couple of moments talking about other roles that Bob plays at Pepperdine. As a teacher, Bob is beloved by his students, so much so that they call him Coach. As dean, I have the privilege of reading the faculty's student evaluations. And Bob's evaluations are replete with comments such as these three. Coach Cochran lives out the ethics that he teaches us. Coach Cochran is an amazing human being and professor. This class made me a better person. Words cannot do justice to the way you in this class have impacted me. And finally, this course was the reason that I came to Pepperdine. I learned so much more sitting in this class than I ever will in church. No other class at this school teaches Christian ethics the way this course did. But Bob's most important influence on his students' lives occurred outside of the classroom. Bob's faculty office was right next door to mine, and I spent 4 years jealous as a parade of students would make their way to visit him. He spends an incredible amount of time talking with students about school and life and faith. In 2014, I had the honor of hosting the weekly CLS Bible study in my home when Jim Dash was away. I'll never forget seeing Bob share with the students the difficulties he was going through after his cancer diagnosis. I'll never forget those 50 students circling Bob and praying for him in the midst of a lot of tears. Thankfully, God answered those and the many other prayers as Bob continues his amazing recovery in his battle against cancer. As a faculty member, Bob is admired, respected, and loved by his colleagues. In fact, some people call him the glue that holds the faculty together. Bob became a dear friend of mine during my 6 years at Pepperdine. A few of you have heard my faith story. I came to faith relatively late in life, 39 years old, 4 years ago. The most impactful part of my spiritual journey was joining a men's group in Cincinnati. We met weekly in the early morning for 6 years, and we grew incredibly close with each other, helping each other deepen our faiths as we shared the good and the not so good part of our lives. When I came to Pepperdine, I was excited about joining a similar group, and to my surprise, there was not an existing group, and when I asked around, others had not ever been in one. So I decided to start a group, and Bob was the first person that I asked. These 6 of us vary in age from 70s, 60s, 50s, 40s, and 30s. And through that experience and others, I got to know Bob very well. The more time we spent together, the more I grew to admire, respect, and love Bob. The only thing I regretted about becoming dean was we had to disband that men's group because for some reason folks felt a bit awkward to share their innermost thoughts with me anymore. Bob is an amazing man and an amazing friend and colleague. Indeed, I made him sound like a saint. But in the interest of full disclosure, Bob has a dark side. Like all of us. I'm speaking, of course, about what happens to him when he goes on a tennis court. Some of us on the faculty, Barry McDonald, somewhere in the room I saw, Danny DeWalt, and others regularly compete on the court, and what we lack in talent, we make up for with our type A personalities. Bob and I have played many times, and frequently I've had to endure one of the most annoying sounds in all of nature. Bob screaming, "Yes!" when he wins an important point. Unfortunately, others haven't seen this dark side of Bob. When I returned home from a tennis match, my wife, Courtney, asked me, "How did you do?" And if I have played Harry or Danny or someone else and I happen to win, she says, "Oh, that's great." But if I tell her I beat Bob, she says, we invited the Cochrans over to our home for dinner one night, and so Bob and I played tennis first, and Denise and Courtney thought it'd be fun to watch. They both rooted for Bob. And that's true. This event is a bittersweet one for us at Pepperdine. We are looking forward to spending the day hearing about the enduring legacy Bob believed in law, religion, and ethics. But he will leave an even greater legacy at Pepperdine Law and the lives of many of us he has coached through the years. When Bob retires in July 2020, we will deeply miss this great and good man. Thank you all.
Without much transition, I just want to introduce Ken Elzingo from the University of Virginia, who is he's been a visitor at Pepperdine a couple of times actually in the past, and he's going to be the moderator, and I'll leave it to him to introduce our first panel on law and religion.
Okay. Thank you, Derek. In terms of academic taxonomy, I'm either the statistical outlier at this conference, or the token economist, or the person most in need of an introduction on this panel. My day job is teaching economics at the University of Virginia, and I'm not exactly sure how it works with your tribe, but if this were an economics conference and I were the moderator of a panel, that would probably mean that I was the oldest person on the panel, and whatever was the particular topic of the panel, I would be the grand poobah on that subject. And I'd know all about the work of the speakers, and at the end of the session, I would be the one called upon to offer measured praise of what the three of you said, and mild criticism of your work, and then be called upon to say what would be the directions for future research. That's how it's done in my tribe. None of that works for me as the moderator here, except I'm the oldest person at the table, and probably the oldest person in the room. So my introduction of the topic for this panel, which is law and religion, will be very brief. And so will be my introduction of the three speakers, Professors Carmella, McConnell, and Skell. So as an alternative to what moderators usually do, let me say something that will surprise you, perhaps even astonish you. You think you're at this conference because of Bob Cochran, but actually, by one measure of causation, all of you are here because of me. Without turning that into a shaggy dog story, let me explain. I met Bob when he was in law school at the University of Virginia. We became friends. I'm on the Arts and Sciences faculty, not the law school faculty, but I hang around with the law faculty a bit, and I was pretty active as an outsider with Law Christian Fellowship, where I got to know Bob, and plus Bob attended the church that I attended. Bob graduated from the University of Virginia Law School, and he became, in addition to a friend, a person with whom I went to church, Bob became my attorney. Fortunately, I did not need attorney services a lot, but at times I did, and Bob was my trusted legal counselor. I also was on the board of a Christian Study Center in Charlottesville, and Bob and I were both involved in that, I primarily as a board member, Bob as a participant, and he came to the study center and to me and said he would like to teach a course on the book of Romans. And I believe that was the book of the Bible. And I said to Bob, somewhat gently, there are probably 20 people in Charlottesville who could teach a course on the book of Romans, perhaps as well, if not better, than you could. But why don't you teach a course on Christianity and the law? That is, in econ lingo, something in which you have a comparative advantage, even if you've never done it before, because nobody else could do this the way you might be able to do it. And that began a trajectory for Bob of teaching in an area that in Charlottesville was largely, not totally, but largely unexplored. And Bob began to develop a course, but also a way of thinking and an academic trajectory, even though he was practicing law in Charlottesville, Virginia. And as I began to see Bob develop in the world of books and ideas, and not just in the practice of law, and as I began to see his passion for the things of Christ, but also his passion for the world of books and ideas, I thought, Bob, you need to be in the academy. You need to be in the academy. Now, where would Bob fit? Where would he fit where his desires to integrate law, Christianity, where would that fit? What type of law school? And in God's grace, Pepperdine was the ideal place for this young guy who was leaving the practice of law, going into the world of the academy, and wanted to develop not only his skills as a teacher, but to develop and work within a fairly new and tremendously important field. And I've always, so Bob was my friend, but also as I watched him go off to Pepperdine, I had a continuing interest in his work. And Bob, whatever expectations I had for you, and they were high, you have exceeded them. You are a gifted scholar. Everything I hear about you as a teacher is that you're gifted in the classroom. You mentor people. You care about them as people created in God's image. You're an entrepreneur in a way that I never have been. You have an institute that you've developed and raised funds for. All the while, again, from my observation, you've been a model husband and a dad. So all of you should be greatly indebted to me for this our being here. Now, let me set the ground rules for the panel. I'm going to sequence the speakers using non-market allocation. Instead, I'll use alphabetical order. And because there are negative externalities associated with speaking too long, I'm going to assign property rights of 15 minutes for each of you, so that we have a residual variance for audience participation. So, the topic, from my perspective, Brobdingnagian, law and religion? I mean, that would be like I was at moderating a panel on economics and politics or something like that. But, so we got this broad topic, and we'll begin the Cochran festschrift with Professor Angela Carmella of Seton Hall University School of Law.
I assume I'm taking the podium. Good morning. What a pleasure to be here. Thank you to Derek for inviting me to this wonderful tribute to Bob, and I hope I don't cry. I think that my time working with Bob and Michael was absolutely the high point of the last 30 years in academia. I was really blessed to have been invited to work with them on that project. I jumped at the chance to work with them because the relationship of law and Jesus and church and government and ethics and politics, love and justice, all those ideas, trying to integrate them, that relationship had been an issue for me in one way or another since I was in college. And there I was 20, the 20-year-old me, a long time ago, in the late 70s, making appointments with professors to ask questions, what can I be reading? And so many faculty members at Princeton were really puzzled by the question. Sort of an unintelligible question. So some did provide wonderful guidance. I was able to study with Paul Ramsey, the beloved Paul Ramsey, ethicist, and I studied Old and New Testament at the Princeton Theological Seminary, so I'm indebted to my Presbyterian friends for that. I wrote my thesis on Catholic social teaching. So I had some resources, a lot of good resources, but it was very eclectic, and I was trying to synthesize things, and never felt that I was doing it right. So I thought if I went to both law school and divinity school, then it would all make sense. But of course that didn't happen. Those worlds never met. And I ended up focusing most of my intellectual efforts on the religion clauses because I felt that the real location for religious discourse in America what was happening in those interpretations in those court cases. It was kind of a sad truth that that was where our religious discourse appeared in litigation. And it certainly didn't answer those questions that I had as that 20-year-old me with respect to the integration of love and justice and ethics and government. Didn't answer them for me, but at least it was a place to focus. So in 1996, when I got an email from Bob and Michael McConnell inviting me to co-edit with them Christian Perspectives on Legal Thought, the timing could not have been better. I had recently taken a sabbatical and spent that sabbatical renewing my look at Catholic social doctrine and grappling yet again with how to put it all together. So for today's reflection, I've read again Bob's the 5 books, the big volumes. I know he's written very prolific. You're very prolific, Bob. There's a lot that you've written. But I've looked at the collaborations, the volumes, the edited volumes that address one way or another the relationship of Christianity and civil law, government, and justice. And it dawned on me that those volumes speak directly to 20-year-old me. They provide the roadmap that I so needed. They are not an answer, because you don't want an answer. There's never a final answer. But they would have provided that path for navigating that interrelation and integration of love, ethics, law, and justice. And they do it by looking squarely at the diversity within Christianity and its interrelation with real on-the-ground law. Now, these volumes also speak to 60-year-old me. They help me retrieve my early understandings that were developed in a Protestant context and help me situate my Catholic understandings in the wider Christian intellectual tradition. Well, Bob is amazing. I don't have to tell you that. He's prolific, collaborator extraordinaire. And I'm not even talking about the work in professional responsibility, just in law and religion. He frames issues fearlessly, identifies the right people to contribute, ensures that their work coheres around the theme. I know I'm doing a piece for him right now, and he certainly makes sure that our work coheres around the theme of the book, absolutely. One thing I noticed is very little overlap in the authors of the pieces. I mean, there are familiar names, and most of us are here, but there's always tremendous outreach, new voices, new perspectives, creating this ever-widening circle of scholars making these connections. The books, of course, draw deeply on the Titans, the Augustine and Aquinas, Calvin, Luther, and my beloved Paul Ramsey, a more recent great in the field, but they don't stop there. They pull Christian insights from folks who are writing now, and they also pull those insights right into the fabric of our social life, right into the law. Private law, public law, international law, immigration law, intellectual property, environmental law, etc. The insights are varied, but the very act of grappling affirms this law-faith relationship. But these volumes also show me that religious discourse in America is not limited to the religion clause cases. It's not limited to the happenstance of a particular group suing the state on free exercise or establishment clause grounds. Bob's collaborative work produces bodies of writing that are forward-looking, that show us a path, that indeed multiple paths, and thoughtful Christians the paths that thoughtful Christians might take on matters of law and society, love and justice. And his own contributions to those volumes, in them, Bob gently invites the reader to consider the transforming power of Christian love as applied to not only to the individual heart, but to laws and governance of legal institutions. So these volumes reveal most beautifully his discipleship, how he is as a follower of Jesus. He brings people together to reflect on Jesus' words and ministry, because that's where it all starts. And in his writings, that his voice is clear, but there's no ego. Bob takes the reader on a walk with Jesus, kind of like he wanted to take us on a walk yesterday, even though it was kind of chilly. But walking with Jesus as a familiar friend, and he's also just not afraid to let the biblical text take him where it leads. He's earnest as he walks with Jesus, is comfortable with uncertainty, and unavoidable indeterminacy of our answers. He rejects triumphalism, and he truly appreciates the multiple approaches to questions of Christian engagement with law and government. He wrote in Christian Perspectives, Christians need humility, clarity of vision, courage, and each other if we are to remain true to Christ. And yeah, that pretty much sums up his message. So I'd like to point out two things that I particularly appreciated about his writing that come right out of his life as a disciple. First, as I said, the focus on Jesus as the source of the analysis. He delights in Jesus' colloquies with the lawyers of Jesus' day to see how he interpreted the civil law, and concludes, as have others, that Jesus' love for us becomes the yardstick by which we measure the civil law, agape. That is the universal love for all of humanity that is not based on merit, deserved. Bob quotes William Temple, who said, "It is axiomatic that love should be the predominant Christian impulse, and that justice is the primary form of love in social organization." So lawmaking becomes an act of love, and in so being, law must be evaluated based on its impact on the weak, the vulnerable, the poor. Just as Jesus taught and elevated and included all who came to him, so law should teach and elevate in dignity and include all. Law is not for the benefit of the few, the rich, for the privileged. It must not be arbitrary, cruel, administered in a harmful way. Jesus said law was meant to serve the human person, not the other way around, so that public justice and mercy flow right from agape. There are lots of reasons why agape has not been embraced in Christian legal thought earlier. In my own Catholic tradition, we measure civil law by its conformity with natural law and promoting the common good. Agape is certainly a matter of helping people to flourish. Law can help with that. So there are clear analogies. Common good is about the flourishing of having social conditions in which the human person flourishes. So there's natural law and the common good approximate love in the Jesus story. In the social setting, but they are intended to be universally accessible to all, particular to non-religious. So you don't use religious language, and there's a lot of power to that, a lot of importance to that. But I'm comfortable with the Jesus story, and it's my story too. So I think it's really refreshing to see the discourse so open and so lively. I also note something that struck me in particular with a lot of folks fleeing the border, coming whether it's the caravans or just this focus that we now have on border security and the wall, et cetera, all of this discourse. A lot of people who are talking about it are using the language of common humanity, love for common humanity, and obviously that's not the end of our decision making about border security. But I found it a fascinating. It's fascinating that it has come into the discourse in a very, very powerful way, a very direct way, brought up mostly by Christians who say. And a lot of references to biblical teaching, but also to Jesus' words. And so I just think that's maybe another project in retirement that you may think about, because it's that challenge to us is now in the same language that we're speaking, or at least using those words. The second point I'd like to emphasize is that Bob's work helps to reclaim justice as a central social concept. As a central Christian concept. Of course, it's a major biblical theme, but it's easy to lose sight of the fact. When we were working on Christian Perspectives together, we had asked the great Harold Berman to write the foreword, and he graciously agreed. And in it, when I saw the first, when I saw it for the first time, he noted that in one sentence he said, "Christianity and justice were closely related words." And when I saw that, I was actually taken aback. I first thought, what would my colleagues think in the secular academy? And how did I view such a statement? And I believed it, but it was still jarring. It was a bold claim. Could Christianity actually make this claim that it was a closely related word to justice after so many of our failures in history? Professor Berman reminds us in his foreword that in his earlier book in 1974, he wrote The Interaction of Law and Religion. It was received in silence by his Harvard colleagues, embarrassed at the linking of law and Christianity. And he wrote that, 74. That was roughly around the time that 20-year-old me was wandering in and out of professors' offices looking for someone to talk to. And of course, there were moments in the 80s and 90s that began to break this silence, but Bob's work has really picked up that early momentum and taken on a life of its own, allowing a really full articulation of the connections and integration. Surely his work and the work of the scholars he has gathered over the past many decades, two at least, give a clear answer to that 20-year-old me. Yes, your Christian faith has quite a bit to say about your work, the laws of society in which you live, and the quality of justice in that society. Bob understands and admits the many failures of the past, Jim Crow, et cetera, but he gently invites all to consider that Christian love can transform, perhaps only modestly, the substance of law, and especially the way we administer those laws to ensure the dignity of all. Bob, thank you so much for the privilege of working with you and getting to know you and your legacy and life and answering that 20-year-old me, all those questions. Thank you.
Thank you for coming so closely within your 15 minutes assigned property rights on the clock.
Well, I teach property, so I'm
Oh,
fully aware of
I
the
thought that was a
issues.
Kosian solution to come up with. Professor McConnell, you're up next.
Thank
You
you.
can either speak from here or from the table.
I think I'll speak from here. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's great to be part of this event honoring my old friend Bob Cochran. Bob and I go back to the probably 79, maybe 80, I'm not quite sure, when I graduated from the University of Chicago Law School and moved to Washington, D.C. Something very important in my life happened, which is that I became part of this actually reminds me of what the dean was saying a little earlier, a part of a group. It wasn't church that was transformative. It was a group of lay people meeting once a week. We met on Thursday nights. Everyone except my wife was a lawyer. Everyone except my wife was also male at the beginning, so we integrated the group. But most of them already knew each other because this was an outgrowth of the Law School Christian Fellowship at the University of Virginia Law School. And that was important to them, and they continued to meet now that they were young lawyers in Washington, D.C. And for 6 years, coincidentally, same number of years as the dean, we met every week, and it was the most important spiritual education, certainly, that I ever received. Now, Bob was good friends of most of the people in that group from Virginia. I had not known Bob, and but he had already moved away. I may get some of the details of this wrong, and Bob should correct me, but as you know, he was already off as a law professor and teaching torts. And so he would come back on visits, and when he was in town, he would come to the Thursday night Bible study, and it was just obvious how, what a great friend he was to these people who were becoming such close brothers and sisters in Christ, to me and to my wife. And I also think this was the first glimpse that I had of the possibility that law teaching and Christianity could really go together. I had certainly not seen any model of this, not even close. And so, Bob, why are you, what are you teaching? Torts, why are you teaching torts? And expecting some, torts is one of my favorite classes in law. I was expecting kind of an interesting explanation of why he was attracted to that field, and instead, it's he's talking about the connection between torts and his understanding of the Christian faith. I'd never heard such a thing before. Then a few years later, I began teaching, and we see each other occasionally. Right? We were not particularly close, and we were not in the same part of the country, and this was before the internet, and so you were much farther. Chicago and California were much farther apart then than they are now, and then we got involved with Angela in this project to produce what is ultimately published as Christian Perspectives on Legal Thought. Now, I can remember why I thought this was an important project. I thought it was important because a lot of people said you couldn't. Can you do that? Yale University Press, are they going to publish a book on Christian perspectives on legal thought? It had not been done before. This was just less than 10 years before that, University of Chicago Law School dean almost refused the Christian Legal Society's students permission to meet on the law school, because you just don't do that, right? God blessed the Jewish law students at Chicago, because they started meeting, and of course you can do that, and as soon as they met, then, maybe the Christian students can meet too. But there was a real sense, not just that nobody was thinking about these things, but you shouldn't be thinking about these things. It is a separation between what? Not church and state, it's like church and thought, right? And for Yale University Press to publish something entitled Christian Perspectives on Legal Thought was a marker that, yes, indeed, this is something that can be done. Those were my motivations at the time. What I didn't know is that the experience of working with Bob and Angela on this book would change the way I understood how faith speaks to issues in the area of law, and especially a constitutional society, a free society, because my orientation is much as Angela describes. What's the relationship between doctrine and doctrine? So natural law, only I was trying to figure out, Protestants have an uncomfortable relationship with natural law. So, what is the Protestant equivalent of that, and how does that fit with civil law? And like Angela, I thought that the interface had to do with the First Amendment, free exercise and establishment, and that's how you think about these things. And suddenly I'm working with someone who says, it's all about love. Okay, I don't think I'd ever thought about that before. And it's not just love, there are a number of things about what doctrines Christians adhere to, but what kind of people love Jesus Christ and how important that can be. So what are if you believe in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, what does that do to you? You know, how does it affect the way you behave? Or, as always like constitutional language, how do you exercise this set of beliefs, right? And if you exercise this set of beliefs, how does it make you a different kind of human being? And then, you know, at a more collective level, what does it do for a society when you have a significant number of people, maybe even the large majority of your founding generation, right, are molded by this kind of belief? And how does that influence the creation of a free society? And let me offer just three thoughts about that, not a couple, three thoughts about that I would regard as Cochran-esque. The first thing is, you know, one of the practices that we have as biblical Christians is that our authority is a text that is written down. None of us wrote it, right? It's not our work. It's an outside authority, but also as Protestants, and with apologies to my Roman Catholic friends, the huge difference, the big difference between our religious communities is that we Protestants do not believe that there is an outside authority, a teaching authority of the church which dominates this. We may have learned people from whom we benefit, but we believe that each individual person has the obligation, the duty to God to read the scriptures for ourselves, to draw our conclusions, and to follow those conclusions. Now, when I say for ourselves, that's not quite right, because we're in communities like that Bible study that I mentioned, like, you know, congregations that we may be part of. But what do we do in those? We are not listening to authoritative words. What we're doing is we're arguing. One of the things I loved about this Bible study is, and I think it had to do with the fact that everybody but Mary was a lawyer, we argued about everything. Our principle was we wouldn't stop arguing about a passage until everyone was satisfied that everything had been said, and maybe 2 or 3 times. When we walked in for the first time, they were on the 2nd chapter of Romans. I don't know if this is why Bob wanted to teach Romans. If there was a Romans thing. I didn't even know that until tonight, that was what he was up to. And, you know, 4 years later, we were finishing up the book of Romans. So disputation among equals, but friendly disputation, an understanding that the deliberation among people is the path to spiritual understanding. Now, isn't that also the utopian model of what a republic looks like? You have equal citizens who discuss and debate and deliberate. We don't all agree, right? We don't all agree. It's good that we don't all agree. But we treat each other as equals, and we engage with each other's interpretations, and we just do it. We do it again, and we keep doing it. And out of that, that's the best hope we have on the planet of coming to some sort of superior understanding. That's what a free society is like. Second point: the sovereignty of God. Earliest creed of the church is Jesus is Lord. Sovereignty of God. What does this mean for a free society? It means there's no other sovereign, right? So when the early Christians are screaming, "We have no king but Caesar," they got the point, right? Because Christians cannot recognize Caesar as the ultimate authority. We cannot recognize even our precious United States of America is not an ultimate authority. There is a sovereignty which rises above any earthly thing. And what does that do? It puts politics into perspective. It means that politics cannot be the ultimate. It means that the government might be wrong. It means that we have a higher duty than merely obedience as citizens. I think is a huge virtue, but it's not the only virtue, and it's not the highest virtue. Sometimes there's something higher than that. There's in 1774, when independence is coming, a group of uneducated, intensely religious farmers in western Massachusetts send a letter to Boston giving their opinion upon what kind of government should be formed when we no longer have a king. And what they say, it's like 2 sentences long, and it says, and I quote, "We have no governor," and they miss governor, Goviner, "we have no governor but the governor of the universe." And under him, a States General, which will meet together for discussions of the common good. That's this, but you see the no governor but the governor of the universe is central to the understanding of a free society in which there are no, there's no natural lordship on earth, right? It's, and I think of cases like the flag burning case. I'm pretty politically conservative, and a lot of my friends thought, well, why are you defending flag burning? You're supposed to be patriotic and so forth. And the flag is not sacred. The idea of desecrating the flag, that was the verb that was being used. You can't, the flag isn't sacred. God is sovereign. That means nobody else is sovereign. And I think that this is, again, a foundation of what it means to have a free society. And last, and this is the most Cochran-esque of the 3 points, is love. So our relationship to God and to each other is defined by this thing we call love. And what is that? What are the alternatives? What is it? It's easier for me to understand things when I think, well, what does it not mean, right? So what does that not mean? And I think there are basically 3 ways we might understand our relationship to an all-powerful God. One way is we might understand God to operate through command and fear. When you fear the Lord, there certainly is something in the Bible of this sort, but you obey God because God is all-powerful, and your future destiny is going to be determined, the future state of rewards and punishments. Basically, your task is to obey because of the power of this kind of fearsome sovereign. If that is if you really believe that, and therefore you act like you believe it, your character is molded by an understanding of authority that is based upon that kind of authority, then you're going to be servile. You're not going to be a free citizen. You're going to be an obedient servant to an authoritarian state. I think that the tyrants of the world want people to understand God this way. Then there's another way we might understand our relationship to God, which is one of indifference. Maybe God just doesn't care very much. This is what Thomas Hobbes taught. God is so ineffable, right? He's so on such a higher plane. Sure, he's all powerful, but he doesn't really care very much about what's happening on Earth, doesn't trouble himself about it. And I actually think this is what many of our colleagues believe about God, if they believe in a God at all. And it's very difficult for me to believe that they don't. There's a higher authority, right? So, call it whatever you want. But is it indifferent? And if this is the relationship, well, this leads to an understanding of a kind of cold moral relativism, maybe even a kind of anarchy and antinomianism. There is no moral order of the universe to which we can appeal because God doesn't care. And this leads, I think, to a self-interested, materialistic, atomistic world, right? One in which no one is conforming their conduct to any kind of a higher standard. And then there's the idea of love. Right? And the thing about love is that it isn't indifferent. It does hold up a certain standard. I think of parents with children, and especially with parents with older children. You continue to, there's a standard there, and parents passionately care about passing on these understandings of the good to their children. But their children are free people, right? They are not, parents actually good parents don't want their children to obey out of fear of consequences. They want their children to obey because the children have loved the same thing, right? And kids who love their parents obey not because of fear, they obey because of love. Right? They love their parents so much that they want to conform their conduct to what the parents want, to the parents' worldview. This had a name back in the 18th century. I don't think Jefferson and Madison taught about this, but there were plenty of sermons by patriotic Americans that talked about Christian freedom. And Christian freedom is the idea that we obey God because we love God so much that we want to be the kinds of people that God wants us to be. And this is also what Republican, small r, Republican freedom meant as well, which is that we love our country, meaning our fellow citizens, because countries are just abstractions. We love our fellow citizens. We love that understanding of the nation so much that we want to be self-sacrificial toward it. We obey the laws because we love the country, right? And the relationship is not one of fear and punishment. It's one of conviction and voluntary cooperation with our fellow man. This is exactly the model of small r republicanism that we see every one of our principal founders take this view. They're beautiful statements by Washington, by Adams, by the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 sets this out in beautiful terms, that they believed that authoritarian governments like royalist governments rule by force and fear and coercion. In a republic, we're not going to be that way. People are going to obey and be good citizens because they love the country. And where does this come from? I believe this comes from a people who love God so much, and they understand that is what the relationship between themselves and a higher authority looks like. And so, why does the freest nation on the face of the planet so far, come about from, a place where you have these, crazy dissenting Puritans and others, coming over? I don't think it's any accident that a free nation comes about. by people whose beliefs and practices have been shaped through these aspects of Christianity. So, thank you, Bob, for setting me off on some of these paths.
Okay, Professor Skell, University of Pennsylvania.
So I didn't know Bob in the beginning. I got to know Bob a little bit later than Angela or Michael or Ken. I came to know Bob as what I think of as the convener extraordinaire of evangelicals in particular, and with Rick, evangelicals and Catholics in the law school world. And Bob was the person that was the glue that held all of us together and brought us all together, and from which we have all benefited. Bob also was a peacemaker, and that came home to me when I was working on an article about 10 or 15 years ago called The Unbearable Lightness of Christian Legal Scholarship. I thought, and still kind of think, that it's a really clever title. Not everyone agrees. David Caudill, who's out there somewhere, was not so fond of that title. I got this very nice email from Bob saying, would you consider changing the title of your article before it's in print? And probably I should have taken his advice. I think the moral, although I do still like the title, the moral is you disregard Bob's advice at your peril. But that's the kind of role that Bob has played for many of us, is keeping us together. I mean, the theme that's already emerged is a theme of love. And it's in Bob's scholarship. It's also in Bob's interpersonal relationships. I'm going to go in a slightly different direction with my 15 minutes. I wrote a little essay for what I hope will be a symposium or whatever will come out of this. And what the essay is, the starting point for the essay is the debate over the last couple of years about why it is that evangelicals have been so supportive of President Trump, and what is emerging as a debate within evangelicalism between what I see as pro-Trump people who have supported Trump on the one hand, and on the other hand, people like Mike Gerson and Pete Wehner who are get rid of Trump at all costs type people. This debate is, as y'all all know, ordinarily assessed in political terms. I mean, the conventional wisdom is a lot of evangelicals are sympathetic to President Trump because they like his judicial appointments, they like his stand against abortion, they like his lower regulation approach to lawmaking, and that the folks that don't like him tend to be moderate or liberal evangelicals, or a few people who think that the character issue is insurmountable. I don't have anything directly to add to that debate. The argument that I'm making in this little piece is I think that debate is a symptom of a deeper debate within evangelicalism. And I think, in my view, what the debate ultimately is about is two different conceptions of justice. And it seems to me that the origins and the ultimate location of that debate is in the Sermon on the Mount. And at this point, Dave Van Drunen, I think, will perk up if he hasn't perked up yet. And the general theme of this piece is, I think, the key to understanding what's going on in evangelicalism right now begins with the Sermon on the Mount and different understandings of the Sermon on the Mount and its implications for justice. It seems to me that this is a fitting topic to talk about in a festschrift for Bob, because Bob has written so eloquently about the Sermon on the Mount, and as we've already been hearing, about love and the relationship between love and law. And I'll say a little bit more about that at the end of my remarks. What I'd like to do in this just brief sketch of this essay is two things. One, I want to start with a historical argument about what I think, where I think all of this comes from ultimately, and then I want to say a little bit more about what I see as the current debate. So first, the history. I like to think of the pre-1880 period in American life as the Ten Commandments era in American life. And I don't know whether this is true or not, but I imagine it as an era when if you had to pick biblical texts that were most significant in public discourse, and Michael could correct me on this, I'm quite sure, as could others, that you would think in terms of the Ten Commandments, the Exodus, America's the Promised Land. And again, I'm not going to make any strong claim about that. I may be completely wrong about that, but what I will make a slightly stronger claim about is in about 1880, in American public discourse, from a Christian perspective, I believe we entered a Sermon on the Mount era. From about 1880 forward, the Sermon on the Mount was the key text in public discourse about Christianity and about what the Bible has to say about justice. So where am I getting this from? Who am I thinking about when I make this claim? Well, the first person I'm thinking about is Washington Gladden, who was a pastor in Columbus, Ohio. He was an editor for a period of time. He developed a theory about Christianity and public life that he referred to as applied Christianity. The burden of a lot of his writing was an argument that the Sermon on the Mount in general, the Lord's Prayer in particular, and the Golden Rule in particular, are not just for the church, but they are a blueprint for all of society. So he has this wonderful quote where he says, and interestingly, says in an essay that was published in 1894, which was the year of the Pullman strike, which is kind of the flashpoint of a lot of the labor crisis of the late 19th century. Gladden said, if people just took the Golden Rule seriously, employers and employees would get along and these problems would disappear. He was the inspiration for another group of people in the next generation who called themselves the Brotherhood or the Brotherhood of the Kingdom. The key figure that came out of this group and out of this movement, which is kind of a continuation of the movement of the late 19th century, was Walter Rauschenbusch. In 1907, Rauschenbusch wrote a book called Christianity and the Social Crisis. He wrote a bunch of books after that. The burden of those books was that America could potentially become the kingdom of God. It could be the promised land. I'm overstating his claim a little bit, but he was making those kinds of arguments, that this was a moment where the Sermon on the Mount could be reflected in all of American life. During this period of time, what became known with Walter Rauschenbusch as the social gospel, and that's the label that ultimately stuck, and this was part of a larger theological modernism movement. They were sharply opposed by traditionalist Christians who argued, and many of these traditional Christians were the people who later became known as fundamentalists in the early 20th century. They argued that the Sermon on the Mount is not for all of society. It is for individual Christians in the church. And one of the more prominent of the traditionalist Christians was a man named J. Gresham Machen, who was a professor at Princeton, ultimately founded Westminster Seminary outside of Philadelphia. And I'll read you a little bit of Machen's response to the social gospelers in an amazing book called Christianity and Liberalism. And one of the really interesting things about this, in my view, historically, is all of this is hitting at the same, or coming to a climax, or coming to, I don't know if you'd call it climax, but a point of catharsis at the same time. So there's a very famous sermon called Shall the Fundamentalists Win, is published in 1922. Machen publishes this book in 1923. Here's a quote from the book in response to the view of the social gospelers that we can ignore the miracles, we can ignore a lot about what the Bible has to say, but the heart of it's the Sermon on the Mount. All we have to do is live out the Sermon on the Mount. Here's what Machen says. Machen says, "Strange indeed is the complacency with which modern men can say that the golden rule and the high ethical principles of Jesus are all they need. In reality, no one can satisfy these standards. If the requirements for entrance into the kingdom of God are what Jesus declares them to be, we are all undone. The Sermon on the Mount, rightly interpreted then, makes man a seeker after some divine means of salvation by which entrance into the kingdom can be obtained." And he goes on from there. So the two major sides in this debate are the social gospelers, who make an argument that Sermon on the Mount is relevant to all of society, and we should think of justice in Sermon on the Mount terms, on the one hand. And on the other hand, the traditionalist view, represented by Machen, that the Sermon on the Mount is only for the church. It's not meant to tell us anything about society more broadly. The one chance during this period of time, in my view, for a kind of halfway between those views was William Jennings Bryan, the populist evangelical, three-time presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. William Jennings Bryan didn't unpack this as carefully as a theologian would, but he basically made the argument that the Sermon on the Mount is primarily for the church, but it also has relevance for society as a whole. So if we fast forward from there to the emergence of the religious right in the 1970s, the religious right came from very much the traditional perspective. So if you look at the early writings of Jerry Falwell, both before and after he abandoned the traditional Baptist view that church and state should be sharply separated, his vision of justice is a vision of justice for transforming American society, but it's a vision of justice that's based on the assumption the Sermon on the Mount is for the church, justice outside of the church, justice more largely, looks different. It doesn't look like the Sermon on the Mount. So he promoted something he called a Christian Bill of Rights in the late 1970s, early 1980s, and it had things like strong military for protection, opposition to abortion, opposition to homosexuality, and lots of stuff on religious freedom. The religious right encompasses obviously a lot more than the original Jerry Falwell, but the basis, in my view, of the religious right perspective, out of which I came, as many of us did in this room, is an assumption that the Sermon on the Mount is for the church, not for society more broadly. Since the turn of the new century, there has been what I see as an alternative vision emerging within evangelicalism. It's much, much smaller than larger religious right, but it includes people like Tim Keller and Russell Moore and Claude Alexander. And these folks have been attacked by some within evangelicalism as a return of the social gospel. So many of you have seen from quite near here John MacArthur's recent principles, kind of anti-social gospel principles. He's, in my view, implicitly accusing people like Keller and Moore of being social gospelers. I think that's a little bit off. I think what the new movement within evangelicalism is hearkening back to is not really the social gospel, but to William Jennings Bryan, and to a view that the Sermon on the Mount is primarily for the church. They are fully orthodox in the way that Bryan was fully orthodox, but that it also somehow has relevance for how we conceive of justice and what secular law looks like. The new movement, if you can call it a movement, isn't like Bryan in all respects. Bryan was fairly criticized as being anti-intellectual in his time. He was also not fully pluralistic. He lived in a very different world than we did, and he was not quite as sensitive to things like race as folks would be today, although in my view, he was much better on these issues than a lot of people were. But the spirit of Bryan's approach seems to me to be very much reflected in this new movement, which I call Neo-Bryanites. I call them Neo-Bryanites. If you were predicting what's going to happen with evangelicalism, I think you'd talk about politics. The traditional religious right is very powerfully politically, and that has a gravitational pull on people. Demographics points in the opposite direction. Young folks tend to be a little less sympathetic to the traditional religious right. And non-white immigrant evangelicals also are not quite as natural a constituency for the traditional religious right. But I also think the debate is going to be theological, and that arguing about what the Sermon on the Mount means, does it have implications for justice, is going to be an important argument in the coming years. And that's where I think Bob's work really comes in. Bob comes out of the religious right, but as I read your work in the last 10 or 15 years, it looks more and more to me like what I'm calling a Neo-Bryanite perspective. And on that note, I want to just conclude with a little quote from Bob's chapter in this book with Dallas Willard, which really beautifully encapsulates the vision of what I see as a Neo-Bryanite perspective. And here's what Bob and Dallas said, if I can find it. They said, and they're responding to the view that the Sermon on the Mount is only for the church. It's not relevant for our conception of justice more broadly. In our view, they wrote, this view that the Sermon on the Mount is only relevant to the church and the golden rule doesn't apply outside of the church, quote, too neatly avoids the difficult work of determining the implications for the state of Jesus' teachings on love. There is no basis for such a division of authority in Jesus' teaching. Indeed, he taught that love is the framework on which the law hangs. This may not be the last word in the coming debate, but in my view it is a good and thoughtful word, a word that gets to the very heart of the evangelical divide on questions of justice.
Let me express my thanks to the three members of the panel and reluctantly concede that this is a lot more interesting than a lot of the panels I attend at economics meetings. I have to say that. And this is really interesting stuff and important stuff. The dismal science doesn't always get at the kind of issues that we deal with here. Well, I have a lot of questions I could ask the three of you, but I will try to use Michael's term, Cochranesque, and be loving towards the rest of you and restrain myself with my own questions and turn it over to the audience, or for the three of you to ask questions of one another. Let's start with the audience. David, I'll start with you.
Great. Well, I really appreciate the panel and all of the papers for the remarks were inspirational. I'm really interested in David Steele's paper. I think this is fascinating to me and really timely. I'm really looking forward to that. If you give it a good title, it might work.
Well, let me run it by you. It's called Divided by the Sermon on the Mount at the moment.
That'd be fine. I approve that. I won't be writing a response to that. I do think it's very important and timely, but I have to confess that I'm a little confused right now. So let's take the two groups we're talking about as those people who support Trump within evangelicalism and those who are against Trump as evangelicals. So which is the one that would take the Sermon on the Mount as applicable to everybody, and which is the one that would take the Sermon on the Mount as only applying to Christians?
So I don't want to make an argument that that maps too neatly. The argument is that there's friction within evangelicalism, and the deep source of it is different understandings of justice, and in particular what the Sermon on the Mount means for justice. But my mapping is that the supporters of Trump disproportionately come from the traditional religious right. So it's Jerry Falwell Jr., who I went to law school with. It was actually the same year as me. Outspoken supporter, Robert Jeffress. A little more tentatively, Eric Metaxas, folks like that. I'm mapping them onto the view that the Sermon on the Mount is not for society broadly. Whereas the Mike Gerson, Pete Wehner, the Never Trump folks disproportionately come from the Sermon on the Mount applies to everybody. It's not a perfect mapping. So a good example of this, in my view, is Marvin Olasky, who came up with the idea of compassionate conservatism. He's very much traditional religious right, but he's a never-Trumper. I mean, he wrote a cover story for World Magazine saying Trump should step down in 2016. So it's not a perfect mapping, but I do think that that what's animating the different perspectives is deeper than the current president. Yeah.
Yes. So I really like and agree with the way you're making use of the Sermon on the Mount. I think it maps some of the stuff that I see in the theological discourse. I'm thinking about Trump, though, and I want to get your
I was trying not to talk about Trump.
I want to get your reaction to an alternative thesis about Trump's supporters and Trump opponents. And, how about this one? The American heritage is unequivocally good, or the American heritage is, and I think, so, well, let me lay out another sort of triad that resembles yours. So American heritage, unequivocally a happy story. American heritage, unequivocally a nasty story rotten to the core from the very beginning. And maybe you put Gerson et al. In the middle camp about that. So you're telling, in essence, more Augustinian sort of a story about, you can analogize to Rome and Rome's own self-image, and see some of Trump's supporters as people who, coming out of the religious right, buy into this happy narrative about America that wants to suppress, the racism and injustice that people like Gerson sort of wouldn't want to do. Anyways, your reaction to that as a sort of way of mapping that story.
Can I throw out yet another alternative?
Absolutely.
So I think, ironically, given the slogan, Make America Great Again, I think evangelicals who support Trump primarily do so defensively out of fear that they're heading to the catacombs. And I think that the anti-Trump people still imagine that they may be running a country, or citizens who are able to propose policies, and think that we ought to only have policies and presidents who would be reasonable leaders of the whole country. And the former group, I think, believes that they are at a crisis point where they're going to be wiped out, and they just want a guard dog. And when you hire a guard dog, you don't look for one with Christian virtues.
That's a great metaphor. And I'm quite sympathetic. I mean, I see those as compatible stories. I mean, you could separate them out, but it strikes me as very much in keeping with where the religious right came from. So I think of the emergence of the original, I won't get into this. I talk about this a little in the essay, but when you think back to where the original religious right came from, it was in the aftermath of the 1960s Supreme Court prayer decisions And it was a sense that the culture is going somewhere, is slipping away. And there's always been a defensiveness, not necessarily bad, but that's just a description, I think, to the religious right. And I think the support for Trump has a lot of that same quality. I mean, the guard dog metaphor, I think, is a great metaphor. That wouldn't necessarily map onto a vision of original American history, although it maps more neatly onto a fall from Eden kind of view of American history. But those sorts of things seem to me what's going on, at least from within my little bubble, which is not representative. Most of us are in the same bubble. But,
Mark?
10 seconds on this. The government had not made the argument before the court that institutions with traditional understandings of sexual morality, like Bob Jones, existed.
Yeah.
We would have President Hillary Clinton.
That's it. Yeah. Well, that statement in, I guess it was in, I forget which of the was it in Obergefell when Don Borelli basically said, we can't rule it out. I think that was a pretty important moment. I have to agree. Yeah. Oh, yes. I'm sorry.
I was just wondering, especially given the racial split in evangelicalism on particularly voting patterns, it seems to me that one of the core questions is not just the theological abstract ones of how we view this Sermon on the Mount, but who we view as our neighbor. And so you see the racial minorities tending to have a more expansive view of who that neighbor is that applies. Whether the dividing line is church and state, whether it's between citizen, non-citizen, and then you have the wider evangelical history that reads that as one central identity, as being the American Christian ideal specific. And that those people are the neighbors, the ones who the kind of generosity and love applies to. So do you think that in your framework, is that dividing line between who that neighbor love and justice, is it church and state? Or can you imagine it being other social lines as well?
I'm not sure if I'm fully following the end of the question, but I'll give a reaction, and hopefully you can come back if I'm missing the question a little bit. But I would frame it in terms of pluralism. I mean, and I think it maps relatively closely onto what you're saying about who your neighbor is. But it seems to me there's a tendency within the traditional religious right of being uncomfortable with pluralism, whereas the what I call the neo-Bryanite perspective is much more comfortable with pluralism, and I think you could define that as having a broader conception of who your neighbor is. I also think that it's complicated or reinforced by the political implications, because the voting, the willingness to get really strict about who can vote, I think, is born of this perception that the society is slipping away, and we've got to protect the status quo however we can. You know, that may be a little bit of overkill, but I think there's some of that there, that it's as long as you're using what look like neutral standards, everybody has to meet the same standards, even though we know they're going to have a disproportionate impact. It's okay because society is slipping away, and I know it's important that our side maintain control. But am I getting I'm sort of redefining who your neighbor is, but it seems to me that who your neighbor is a question of pluralism and comfort with pluralism, at least in part.
Right, and so I think that's one of the interesting things about the different ways that specifically the voting divide and split in evangelicalism is that it maps not perfectly, but very specifically on racial lines. And so that, to me, speaks to a different experience of American history, an experience of faith, and then a different perspective on what it means to engage with your neighbor and love your neighbor, and from what position of society to do that. And so I think that's
Yeah, that's interesting, and I think that,
I'm going to call time on this because the conference schedule lists 10:45 as time for our coffee and tea break. Here's a little known fact for all of you who teach just in law schools. So if you look on the back wall, there's a clock, and actually we're running a little bit late. Believe it or not, I have students at the University of Virginia now who cannot tell that that says approximately 10:45. They do not know how to read a clock except for digital time. So for those of you who can read that, it's time for our break. Thank you very much, everybody.
so thankful for the clock, because that usually when you come into a room like this, there isn't a clock up there.
My students can read the clock.
I know, yeah, me too.